All right. Well, we are starting a bit late because the person I call the boss, Laura Ellsworth, asked us to because the keynote was, the second keynote today was still ongoing, and we wanted to have as many people here as wanted to be here. But we will get underway. Welcome to panel number 5.11, Strategies for Protecting the Election Process. I have to say that because I'm told that there are people live streaming who may not be on the right panel and they need to know what panel number this is, so I have to say that every time I introduce a panel. My name is Tim Lewis, and it's my honor to introduce this panel and also to have a conversation with the panel members as the moderator. I'm asked also to remind you that questions can be submitted using the QR codes which are on either side of the room. This panel is going to be focused on projects that are currently underway to support a peaceful election process and to protect that process from hate-fueled and inspired violence. And that doesn't just include overt physical acts. That also can include overt lies and denials that can also do violence to the democratic process. We do have an esteemed panel, if I may say. First, to my immediate left is Mary McCord. Mary is a visiting professor of law and the executive director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown University Law Center. And in that capacity, she leads a team that brings constitutional impact litigation around the country in both state and federal courts, covering a wide variety of areas. Mary has also served as an acting assistant attorney general for national security and as a principal deputy assistant attorney general for national security, and spent some 20 years or close to 20 years as an assistant United States attorney in Washington, D.C. I would also note that I have met Mary before because we are working together on a project called Keep Our Republic, which she will discuss in her presentation, which is also focused on election integrity and protecting our election process. We are also joined by Rachel Brown. Rachel is the founder and the executive director of an organization called Over Zero. Now, Over Zero seeks to build resilience to identity-based violence and other forms of group-targeted harms. She is a highly esteemed and widely recognized expert on confronting hateful rhetoric and on the use of communication to prevent violent conflict. Just on a personal note, if I may, Rachel is also a fellow jumbo, having graduated from Tufts University, albeit many light years after I did, and undoubtedly with a much higher grade point average than I did, and we welcome Rachel. Next to Rachel is Jory Craig. Jory is the head of elections and digital integrity at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. At the ISD, Jory does research and conducts advisory work around online threats to elections and public opinion. For many years, she has worked to help elected officials, political leaders, media outlets, academic institutions, and civic organizations to measure the impact of digital communications and influence campaigns on public opinion, and to address threats of disinformation campaigns, of which there are unfortunately many today. And finally, we are joined by Bill Braniff. Bill is the director of the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism and he is a professor at the University of Maryland. Bill is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, and he has previously served as the Director of Practitioner Education at West Point's Combating Terrorism Center. He is a renowned counterterrorism expert, but importantly, Bill has also founded an organization called We the Veterans. And that's really what will be the focus of Bill's participation here today because of, as you will learn, because of the meaningful ways in which that organization implicates our election integrity. And I'm talking about on the ground, hands-on, directly implicates our election integrity. He will discuss that. As I mentioned, my name is Tim Lewis, and as I said, I'm honored to serve as a moderator for this panel. And with that, we will get underway. Starting with Mary McCord. Mary, I wonder if you could discuss with us the independent state legislature doctrine, which a lot of people don't know about, but which is very important to election integrity and could be adopted by the United States Supreme Court. And if it is, perhaps you can discuss the impact that it will have on election integrity. I think the case is called, I know the case is called Moore versus Harper, that is now pending in the Supreme Court. And it would, I think, be interesting for us to learn more about that, what it means. And also, if you could address some of the state laws that affect poll workers and elections and how they are either being enforced or not being enforced, and what that means to our election integrity. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to do that and happy to be here. So this is kind of the what keeps me up at night spiel, right? So for me, it's that merger of hate, political violence, and anti-democracy efforts. And Tim Lewis and I were fortunate recently through Keep Our Republic to participate in a session with a number of leaders in Pennsylvania, former elected officials, judges, leaders at universities, foundational leaders, et cetera, to run through some scenarios. That included things that would impact our elections, both man-made and natural. So, for example, positing a highly politicized time, a lot of political partisanship, gee whiz, what could that be? Imagine just a few weeks before the election that we have somewhere here in Pennsylvania or any place really in the country, a police shooting like we've had in the past, right, of a person of color, and that spurs racial justice demonstrations, that spurs unlawful militias to come into, communities and ostensibly try to protect property, that spurs other types of, even maybe riots, even some property damage. Maybe at the same time you have some other type of disaster. I think in our scenario we had a explosion at a plant that caused a bridge to go out, and that meant people could not readily get to their polling place because this happened, according to our scenario, just the day before the elections. So in this confluence of events, we talked through what are some of the challenges. And before I get to some of those, all of these challenges could be made more difficult, more significant, depending on how the Supreme Court rules on the independent state legislature theory. So this theory is based on two provisions of the U.S. Constitution, the Elections Clause and the Electors Clause. So the Elections Clause is the clause that gives state legislatures the power to determine the time, place, and manner of elections for senators and representatives to the U.S. Congress. And that clause is the one that's at issue in Moore v. Harper. That has been interpreted to mean, even just, without a broad view of independent state legislature theory, that has been interpreted to include things like redistricting. And in fact, this case, Moore v. Harper, comes out of North Carolina. It is a redistricting case. So under the broadest, the other clause, before I go back to that, the other clause is the Electors Clause. That's the clause of the Constitution that gives the state legislature the power to choose the electors, and by that I mean the electors that vote as part of the Electoral College to elect our presidents. Now, of course, at this time in all 50 states, electors are actually chosen, nominated by the party, and then depending on which candidate wins the popular vote, the electors in that state vote for all of their electoral college votes for that candidate. And that is the case in all but 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, where the votes are proportionate. It's still based on popular vote, but then the electoral ballots are split proportionately. All the other states are what's called winner take all, popular vote, then the electors are based that way. Although I will say that's been the case for almost 200 years. Before that, under this Electors Clause, it was the state legislatures who chose the electors for president. But for almost 200 years, it's been based on popular vote. So this theory posits really that in both of these clauses of the Constitution, the state legislature really has the final say, and other than the U.S. Constitution. And so anything the state legislature decides to do cannot be reviewed by a state court, including a state Supreme Court, to determine if it's in compliance with the state constitution. So what does that mean, to get it out of legal mumbo jumbo? In North Carolina, there was a redistricting by the state legislature. It was challenged under laws that allow for it to be challenged as being a partisan gerrymander. It was struck down by the lower courts, struck down by the state Supreme Court as being in violation of the state constitution's Free and Fair Elections Clause. And importantly, in North Carolina, the state legislature had passed a law that explicitly allowed for state court review of redistricting plans by the state legislature. Nevertheless, after the state court struck it down, and by the same legislation that the state legislature has passed, had new redistricting maps drawn to apply to this election, the legislature took this case up to the Supreme Court saying, no, under the independent state legislature doctrine, the state Supreme Court could not do that, did not have the authority, even under the state constitution, to rule on the validity.
So if I may just interrupt for a moment. Mm-hmm. So the very legislature that had passed a law that said the state Supreme Court could review this has now decided, no, the Supreme Court of North Carolina cannot review this.
That's right. And that sounds crazy, right? And that sounds like a good reason that the Supreme Court should have said, we're not taking this case. So I think many of us who litigate in the Supreme Court were pretty surprised that it would choose this case to take. Wait and take some other case where the state legislature hadn't approved the state court's authority to actually rule on redistricting. So it's one of the surprising features because, as you certainly know, being a jurist yourself, the Supreme Court doesn't take every case that comes to it, and this one seems to have an obvious problem. So that's worrisome for how the court might be thinking about this doctrine. And we know from previous cases, going back to Bush v. Gore, and more recently when the state legislature tried to get sort of an emergency appeal early on of Moore v. Harper, we know that there are some justices on the court who are amenable to a broad reading of the independent state legislature doctrine. Just to give you sort of the other side of that, those on the other side of it believe that, okay, we see what the Constitution says. The legislature does have the power to determine the time, place, and manner of choosing representatives and senators, but the independent state legislature has to be considered as part of the state constitution that created it, right? It wouldn't even exist were it not for the state constitutions that created the legislature. So when we look at the state legislature, we have to think of that as the whole package, right? The whole state constitution, the whole form of state governance that was adopted in that state. And so these are sort of the two, in its most simplest form, these are the two arguments. And in fact, that second argument is consistent with principles of federalism, right? Where Congress has left for the states the authority for administrating elections within the state and the authority for governing its state under its own state constitution. So a broad reading of this would mean things like redistricting by independent commissions. Independent bipartisan commissions might not be possible unless the state legislature has the opportunity to approve it or reject it. It might mean that governors, in many states under the Constitution, the governor has the authority to approve redistricting or reject it, and it might mean that that no longer takes place. So that gives near plenary authority to a state legislature to draw as partisan redistricting maps as they want, as well as to engage on so many other issues. So, for example, going back to our scenario, suppose that, it is difficult to get to the polls in Pennsylvania because we've had this rioting in the streets, because we've had, an explosion that is taken out a bridge that people use in order to get to the polls. Can election officials on their own extend the deadline for voting? Can they choose another date for an election? Or if the legislature hasn't spoken on that, are they paralyzed? And so these are just some of the ways this could play out. On the Electors Clause as well, before we get into kind of how to protect against this, the Electors Clause, as I mentioned, gives the state legislators the authority, the power to choose the electors. And as I said, for almost 200 years, they've done that now through the popular vote. But under a broad theory of the independent state legislature doctrine, what is to stop the legislature from just changing those rules and saying, we're going to start choosing the electors for president from here on out? Now, I think most lawyers, including myself, believe that would create a federal constitutional problem if they made that decision after the election, right? Because when people have a reliance interest that they're going to vote, their vote is going to count, their vote is going to translate into, a vote, the electoral votes for president, to change the rules after the vote would raise serious federal due process concerns. But what if they change the rules beforehand? We already know there have been bills introduced in Arizona and Missouri that would allow the state legislature to step in after a vote and override the will of the voters if they believe there's fraud. But what's the standard for fraud? And in this time of disinformation, these are very concerning things. So a broad view of independent state legislature doctrine could really throw some chaos and disarray into election processes. And chaos and disarray is just fertile ground for political violence, intimidation, et cetera. So real quickly, a few points. We've seen a real rise in the last several years of unlawful private militias. These are just private citizens who come together. They often dress in military kits. They usually carry assault-style rifles and other militarized paraphernalia, and they sort of assert authority over other people. Sometimes they offensively storm state houses in opposition to government policies. Many of them stormed the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. Sometimes they usurp the role of law enforcement and take it upon themselves to guard buildings or things like that. They have no authority whatsoever to do that. 3 quick points on that. No authority under federal or state law for private individuals to band together and create their own armies and take and assert that role of law enforcement, security services, combat. It's inconsistent with our history, our constitutional text, and our Supreme Court has said Second Amendment doesn't protect private paramilitary organizations. They've said that now for over 100 years. Second point. That is the second point. Second, the Supreme Court has ruled since 1886 the Second Amendment does not protect private paramilitaries, and states must be able to prohibit them in order to protect peace, safety, and good order. Third point, all 50 states prohibit. They prohibit in their state constitutions. They prohibit it in state anti-militia laws and state anti-paramilitary activity laws. So that's not legal. Those are laws that could be enforced. They could be a basis also for people at the polls to, call the law enforcement if a militia shows up. And indeed, in 2020, my organization put out fact sheets about militias. These got spread very widely, even among militias, and the 3%ers nationwide right before the election put out a directive to its members not to show up the polls in their military kits. They could be arrested for voter intimidation. They actually linked to our fact sheet. So we figure that's a win when the militias are not coming because they're citing Georgetown law. That we'll take it. But other laws too. Voter intimidation is unlawful under federal and state law in every state. And that does not just mean within the no electioneering zone. I think this is something we encountered in 2020, a lot of confusion about. Election workers are like, okay, you can't leaflet in 100 feet of the polls, you can't wave flags, but outside the 100 feet, like that's nothing we can do about. Voter intimidation is illegal everywhere. It's illegal if I come to your house and intimidate you. So it's not a free-for-all zone outside that no electioneering zone, and that's something that poll workers need to know, election officials need to know, and they need to know to call law enforcement if they're having a problem with voter intimidation. That leads to the next point. Law enforcement generally, most state laws, prohibit law enforcement from just being at the polls. It can be very intimidating to voters. We have certainly a history, particularly in the South, of intimidating voters of color. And so they, in most states, with some exceptions like Florida, that says the sheriff has to be at the polls, it's a whole other story, they're not permitted at the polls unless they're called, right, by election officials or by people who feel like they've been victims of voter intimidation. So understanding that and having already, getting yourself involved if you're a poll worker, election official, having an agreement with law enforcement about when and under what circumstances you would call. And then, of course, threats are unlawful. Stalking is unlawful. Cyber harassment. These are things that are unlawful if they're occurring against our election officials, elected officials, poll workers, and others. And we'll talk more about poll workers. But there are tools to try to combat political violence, to try to help maintain safety at our polls. I would also point to many attorneys general and district attorneys in 2020 went out and made public statements. Voter intimidation would not be tolerated. Larry Krasner in Philadelphia actually had me come in and do a press conference with them. No militias are going to be at our polls. So there are things that people can do to spread that word and keep our polls safe.
Thank you. And Rachel, just picking up on the last line of discussion, can you, you have an expertise in rhetoric and communication, and I wonder if you might address patterns of communication that can lay the groundwork for violence that might affect an election, and how these are built through rhetoric that really creates a political narrative. Because we see that more and more over the past few years, and it has become increasingly dangerous. And also, in doing so, if you could address some of the new technologies that are implicated.
Absolutely. And let me just start with the definition that we use for political violence, because I think this is important and it can help us see how the type of hate violence that we've been talking about and extremism that we've been talking about throughout this conference intersect with election violence. They're both types of political violence. And we can think about political violence as an extension of political strategy. When nonviolent means aren't working, or when violence will help attain a strategy more easily or in a different way, it can be used. So in our definition, political violence is violence aimed towards a political end. It is violence that aims to change who controls, benefits from, or participates fully in economic, civic, political, social, cultural life. And what's really important in this definition, we do include threats and intimidation. This is the coercive use of violence for those very same ends.
So the rhetoric itself can be a form of violence.
It depends. Specifically, threats and intimidation, the actual threatening of violence, because what that can do is have a chilling impact on public participation. So when we talk about political violence, what I think is really important to remember is that just one act of political violence, it's not just about the violence itself, it's about the ripple effect it has. It's about the story and the narrative that it also helps create and construct. It's about the impact it has on intimidating people, on chilling public participation, on creating a sense of chaos that might justify crackdowns on the public. etc. So we have to care not just about the violence, but the ground that's sown to make it possible, and the after impact it has. And hate violence can be a form of political violence when it's meant to intimidate specific communities, change their ability to participate again fully in the life of a society, politically, economically. Long history of that here. And then election violence is a form of political violence that happens specifically around election processes. And around the world, we know that this type of violence tends to happen most before and after the actual election day. Beforehand, used to intimidate, to shape who shows up to participate, to attack things like rallies, campaign rallies, also the process of election administration, and then after an election, often to contest results, to interfere with tallying, counting processes, and sometimes to show domination by the winner. I give this context because my background is in genocide and atrocity prevention and election violence prevention, and we see intersecting narratives, but that have some distinctions. And I would say that we see some different seeds of the rhetoric that we see in the lead up to groups being targeted with mass violence here, and we see how that intersects with some of these very common election-specific narratives. So I'm going to share with you some of the patterns we see in their most extreme. Jory, I think, will give us more texture and context of specifically the rhetoric that we see here, but I'm sure things will come to mind. So when specifically groups are targeted, and I think we've seen a ramp up here with different communities, religious minorities, immigrant status, racial targeting of different groups, what happens is the creation of a them or the other. And we see this really clear set of patterns in how groups are othered. One is that a group is portrayed as some sort of an existential threat. A threat to physical safety and security, a threat to purity, carry diseases, often narratives of rape, to the threats to a purity of a group. And we see narratives that they're a threat to our way of life, I'm putting this in quotes, our ability to prosper, economic prosperity, etc. We see narratives of, and what this does is it creates a self-defense narrative. So now violence is not an act of aggression, it is an act of protection and self-defense, so it's justifiable. We see narratives of guilt. This group has already done wrong, scapegoating, they're responsible for bad things. This is a narrative of revenge and making things right. So violence, again, is justified to make things right. And we see dehumanizing narratives that portray a group as totally outside of the moral contract in the extreme comparison to pests and animals, overtly or through things like describing swarms of people. We see this in immigration-related rhetoric. You don't call people swarms. So we see this othering. But part of what that does really powerfully, that I think can be overlooked, is it creates a very rigid, a very exclusive us that needs protection. And so violence is justified on behalf of this narrowed conception of sort of the public, of an us, who is moral and pure and needs protection. We often see narratives that we have to, quote unquote, protect our women and children and valorize violence as sort of an act of heroism to protect the group. And you see these narratives that call upon people to be, quote unquote, good men and stand up with this version of masculinity. We see this narrative that there's no alternative to violence, and I'll get back to that with elections, that it's not that we want to be violent, it's that it's our only option for protection, and that it's what's necessary to create a better future where we can be safe and secure. And part of this that comes over and over again is this peer social pressure to go along with this. So if you're not on board, you don't really care about protecting our group. So we see people who stand up against this type of narrative be really shut down, called sort of traitorous, naive, and many other things, and be punished. And so when it comes to elections, you can see that part of what this narrative does, it creates this environment of threat, this very high stakes environment. So when it comes to the election narrative specifically, we see narratives that are about a political opposition that is threatening. And the election doesn't just become about a policy win or a loss. It is a high stakes game and a winner takes all game that is very zero sum. If they win, it's not just, hey, we're out of power for a little while. It's sort of all is lost, this existential threat. In that environment, violence becomes justifiable as a way to contest or impact the outcomes of an election. And what we see this coupled with, and we've really seen this in the US, is that the system itself starts to be attacked. So we see that in attacks on election administrators and officials and in the electoral process. And you see consistently, it's an alarm bell when we see this as an early sign, where we see political leaders talking about an election that will be stolen, making preemptive declarations of fraud, or trying to undermine trust and credibility of the process.
May I just interject for a moment?
Yeah.
Throughout our nation's history, we have seen this polarization that you're describing and the othering of people by political movements, political parties, individual politicians, and so forth. I guess my question is, what is different today? I mean, you just mentioned election deniers and questioning legitimacy of the process itself and so forth. Is that the key difference and that arises from now, today, the othering and all the other things that you just described, and that has led to this political violence that we're discussing?
Yeah. I mean, I guess one thing I would say is that this is not our only moment of more intensive political violence in our country's history. So some of when we look at history, those periods of time where people were mass disenfranchised, where we've seen political violence used to prevent people from acquiring wealth. Our history of racial terror lynchings is an era of widespread political violence. So what's unique about this moment as compared to 20 years ago or something like that, something that really matters and that we look at in these global frameworks is also who are the messengers and who are these narratives reaching? Is it sort of relegated to fringes of society, or are we seeing it from leaders who have credibility and following? And we know this from studies. It matters what leaders say, whether people approve of political violence. And so I would say that one of the things that we are seeing is in many ways attempts to institutionalize and infiltrate really mainstream institutions with these types of narratives and this rhetoric. And we're also seeing it from people who hold offices of political power and from major media institutes. And so I think a large part of it, it's not just, is the narrative floating around somewhere? Is it organized? Does it have charismatic leaders that have reach? Is it reaching people? How is it being spread? We see this is where we get to the channels. It's not just that we see social media and online. We see how that is intersecting and working together with things like movie screenings that are traveling around. So we're seeing how widespread is this narrative, and is it reaching people that it's resonating with and who might mobilize? And are there organized groups and ways for them to get involved and actually take action? So I think it's the lining up of all these things. It's not just does the narrative exist, it's how is it coming into form, and what does the organization and capacity to act on it look like?
Can you share with us some of the technologies that are now implicated and how they affect the election integrity in addition, in light of all of the things that you have just outlined, please?
So in keeping with giving a slight macro perspective and knowing Jory's expertise of being engaged deeply and looking at a lot of these platforms, I will just give us the context that every time there is a new communication technology, it impacts these conflict dynamics. I got my start in Kenya where text messages were used to fuel election-related violence, and cell phones and text messaging technology enabled rumors, what we would call disinformation now, propaganda, to travel farther and faster because people could forward messages and let it travel across geographies. That seems very quaint now, looking at our social media landscape. There are a lot of different platforms. One thing that this new type of technology, social media, does that I think is new and novel is the degree to which it enables people to be saturated with information, the specific algorithms that pull people into different rabbit holes, and also the ability to find belonging and community online. There's a lot of beautiful early promise. Someone might be struggling with an issue. Maybe they're sort of left out or even discriminated against in their community. They can go online, they can find community, they can find belonging. That also is true for a white supremacist movement, right? These groups can also find a space online where they might be against sort of the norms or expectations of their own community, but they can band together and start to build critical mass. And that ability to find belonging and community is really important when it comes to mobilizing for violence. It's not just individuals. And even when we see people that are quote unquote acting on their own, they're often acting in their mind as part of a broader movement, right? They're acting as part of a community, and they're expecting to to get status and recognition within that community. It just exists online. So we need to understand what are the features of a new technology to understand what new affordances it's giving to violence. And I think I've also seen this in my work globally and see it here. It's never just one technology or one communication platform. It's how do they go together. The mainstream narrative still matters. It's quotes and videos from leaders that are recognized and credible figures that are circulating on these platforms, right? From mainstream news. So we need to look at the full communication ecosystem, and that does include some more analog pieces like these traveling films and things like that. So I think it's a complex ecosystem of communication right now that requires us to wrap our heads around it and be positioned to influence across it.
Now, we had discussed in focusing on some of these issues before today, something that our audience may not know too much about, and I'm not sure whether you wish to discuss this or jury is going to discuss it, but landscape mapping and election protection. Jury, is it your turn now, or?
Sure.
Okay.
It's happy. You already know what I'm going to talk about.
Right.
So landscape mapping, I think the word landscape is pretty intuitive. I am the daughter of a football coach, so it's like watching tape before a game of who you're going to play. I used to talk with my team about knowing your turf. And people use landscaping to describe different things. In my case, our team talks about landscaping because before we're going to go in and look at any state level information ecosystem that we're going to pay attention to, any country level information ecosystem that we're going to pay attention to, we first want to understand the narratives and the networks that are relevant to those spaces. It's not really responsible of us to go into those environments and have a say on them if we can't first deeply understand the narratives and the networks. And that means on and offline networks, on and offline narratives. And I think landscaping can also mean understanding which offline groups, leaders, activists, organizations, funding streams exist in a space before you go into those spaces and pay attention, try to roll out a program or be involved. I think this has a little bit to do with the solution side and the solutions that are being brought to these states and brought to the US right now, especially given how many people have been paying attention to issues like this for decades compared to those who paid attention only after January 6th. So I think that's something we can talk about in the strategy side, but I do just want to make a couple comments building on what others have said. First, as mentioned, my background's in elections, and whenever I'm talking about elections, I'm always emphasizing that forever and ever, elections have been really a petri dish, an opportunity for bad actors of all types to come together in a moment where conditions are rather ideal, more so than other times of the year. It's a high-stakes environment naturally, and so I too have a background in doing this work globally. And we see how bad actors come together at election moments to mess with the public, mess with democracy, and we've been seeing that for a long time. For me, and this is unique to my experience and my career trajectory, what changed was the mass uptick and uptake of the use of social media. And I say social media, not just social media as a communications platform, but emphasizing the social aspect of social media. Social media is not a one-way broadcast communication tool. Social media is a social network, and in many ways, the product features mirror things that happen in our own society. And so the way that bad actors have used and benefited from the product features that have been rolled out to make social media platforms more profitable and able to scale, I don't think it's possible to continue on with the way that we are seeing and interacting with these problems at scale without acknowledging that that has happened over the past decade or so. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I want to emphasize is that often when we're talking about disinformation, and it's important to talk about disinformation, as others have mentioned, and not only threats. The two are, my Sasha, who's the CEO of ISD, likes to say it's a hybridized landscape. I think we're all learning that. They all interact with each other. But I want to talk about disinformation because I think often we're hearing about disinformation and the content that's contained within disinformation, the specific lies or falsehoods. That's really making it easy for the people who benefit from disinformation being something that's profitable for them. The content versus systems framing of this conversation is a really important framing because if we're talking about the content of these lies only, we're really quickly getting into a conversation about censorship and the First Amendment, and all of a sudden people who are concerned about types of content are easily put on the side of censorship, and those who are saying, we want our content to be allowed are easily on the side of the First Amendment and freedom of speech. We don't want to be in this debate because it's a false dichotomy and it's not useful to getting to productive solutions. We want to be in a conversation around the systems. And the systems that are making all of this possible and making all of this able to scale is what our team is really focusing on highlighting in the research that we're doing. So yes, I can tell you that my team, looking at Pennsylvania, Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Georgia in depth over the past year, over the past couple of years, and we'll do this through the elections, I can tell you the specific narratives that are being used, but I also would like to tell you the product features that are being manipulated and used and the policies that are failing to be enforced on the side of the platforms and the policies that should exist but don't exist that could make these things better. Because in just looking at the rhetoric, we're missing a quicker way to get to some of the solutions that are right in front of us. Or if they're not in front of us because we don't have the data that we would need to do that research, they could be if we called for transparency at scale. So I'm happy to go into sort of state-level disinformation narratives and election organizing that we're seeing in these states on the part of bad actors, things that they're doing around pre-election periods, during the elections, and post-elections, the way that they're using the systems that Mary was talking about, the way that they're really smart and good at using very legal mechanisms in addition to illegal mechanisms to mobilize and activate people around their cause. Happy to talk about that, but if you could take one thing away, when you're talking about lies and you're talking about disinformation and those things moving on the internet, I would encourage you to focus on the systems and ask questions about the systems and not just the facts or lack thereof.
When we do that, when we do focus on the systems, are you including the platforms themselves within the systems, what you generally refer to as the systems? And if so, why is it that it is so difficult for these platforms to regulate, that's a loaded term, but to regulate the content in a way that is more responsible? Because there's no First Amendment right, as I understand it anyway, in connection with a privately owned company that is allowing access to its platform. And so have you done work with, or have you done any focus on how that could happen in a way that might improve the overall systems and the system delivery that you're talking about?
Oh boy, do I love this question. I sure have. So yes, I include the social media platforms as contributors to the system, and in some ways, some of the platforms that really have an audience that is more so than any nation state, and control over populations more so than any government body joined together. Their own ecosystem is full of systems also. I of course include them. And when you ask the question of why is it so hard, my sort of funny answer is because money's so attractive. Mm-hmm. But my more focused answer is much of what has been used to try to hold the platforms accountable to date have been content-based, content-focused pieces of legislation. And really we've been far away from having the level of sort of public or leader education that we have needed around the tech companies and the tech platforms and those features for them to look at the policies that the platforms were rolling out on their own and say, hey, why are you not enforcing these, or these are bad, or these are good, let alone design legislation that would actually account for those policies and those policy those policy failures. Now we are moving to a place where regulators are understanding that we cannot use content-based bills to solve these problems. So in France, in Germany, they have had laws around illegal speech that they've tried to use to solve some of these problems. We are now understanding that we're going to have to move to something more like the EU Digital Services Act, which is a bill that looks at and examines and holds to account the systems, business models, internal practices, and really the user experience on these platforms. We just saw a similar bill passed in a totally bipartisan vote in California. Governor Newsom just signed it, the California Age-Appropriate Design Code, which on its face is a bill about keeping kids safe online. But if you look at what it's focused on the systems, the features, the targeting, the data collected, the suggested recommendation contents. And all these systems are being talked about there in the context of keeping kids safe, but they have a huge knock-on impact on the way that, for example, if I go online and I'm watching a video, I'm a kid, I'm watching a video about playing video games. it changes also what I'm going to be recommended, and the likelihood that I'm going to be recommended something that directs me to militia content or directs me to extreme content or pulls me down a rabbit hole. So that systems-based legislation is really important for the direction we're heading. And then there are a whole bunch of other things that would be helpful, including data transparency, because in order for us, as I said, to call out and make a point in our own research about those systems, we would need more systems information than the platforms are traditionally giving us.
Thank you very much. Bill, if we can turn to you now, would you address the importance of becoming involved in the election process as a civic norm? I mean, it's just something that we expect of ourselves, and we hope others will join in and incorporate into that the means to accomplish this really on the front lines, meaning at the polls and in other places. You have created an organization that has, as a part of it, something called you've created We the Veterans, and Vet the Vote is a part of that, that organization. Can you share with us how you are accomplishing the mission that I've just mentioned? And I feel comfortable asking you about accomplishing a mission as a West Point grad and a veteran, but would you address that, please, the work that you're doing there?
Sure, I'm happy to. And let me just go on the record. I'm one of the co-founders of We the Veterans. I'm not the founder. Nope. There's a team there, and it goes, there's Air Force, Marines, Army, Navy. It's awesome. It's an awesome team that has put this initiative forward.
Tell us about it.
Yeah,
please.
sure. So the Vet the Vote Coalition includes, I believe as of yesterday or the day before, 27 veteran service organizations from around the country, 4 civil society organizations, including the NFL, including the Chamber of Commerce. So this is a big coalition. It's a broad coalition. And the reason why a large number of diverse veteran service organizations and civil society organizations can participate is because we're talking about a well-loved civic norm in our country, free and fair elections. We're professional cynics. Like in my day job, I run a terrorism research center. I'm a professional cynic, and I'm joined by professional cynics who are critical thinkers who try to identify challenges, problems, and then figure out what we can do about them. Our elections are robust, they are free, they are fair, they are well governed. And so if we could get veterans and military family members to participate in this incredibly effective civic process, that behavior will reinforce their belief in our democracy. And I know this is a terrorism research center. We study from a behavioral social science standpoint, how people come to arrive at negative behaviors and beliefs. And we all assume, I think, that belief precedes behavior. First I believe something bad, and then I act badly. Or first I believe something good, and then I act in a good way. And the truth is that our behaviors, our day-to-day behaviors, the things that we do, shape what we believe to be good and right. So if I participate in the civic process, I'm going to have more trust and confidence in the civic process. And that is the goal here. Now, there's a critical shortage. There's about 130,000 person shortage in poll workers that were anticipated as of several months ago. And so the Election Assistance Commission, organizations like Power the Polls, have identified this shortage, working with secretaries of state who are basically screaming, saying we need more poll workers. So there's a critical shortage of this kind of volunteerism. And so there is a real call to action here, and we know veterans and military family members respond well to calls to action. If they just know about this issue, our theory of change was they'll show up, right? And actually, talking to Over Zero, as we were trying to think about this campaign, you gave us the best advice you could have given us, which is do not normalize the idea that our polling stations are places of confrontation. They're not, right? So we're taking a very positive approach to this. We don't want to justify or reinforce the norm that our polling stations, that our democratic process is a confrontational one in terms of violence, conflict, threats, and harassment. Does that exist? Absolutely. Like, we know that's happening. We know it's a problem. But if we can create the civic norm and reinforce that civic norm, and transparently, if veterans and military family members are the face of this positive civic norm, they remain a very trusted community and institution in our country. Can they carry us sort of away from this precipice where we get to a new norm in which confrontation is an expectation at our polling sites, right? Which is, of course, a place we don't want to be. So that that positive strengths-based approach is really important. And now to put the terrorism researcher hat on for a second, why is that so important? The adversary in this instance, and we've talked about this a little bit throughout this conference, the Eradicate Hate Conference. We've talked about, R.E. Perliger the other day talked about the clean Klan and the idea that David Duke and that generation of Klansmen realized that they had to put down the jackboots and the red suspenders, and they had to put on a suit and a tie, and they had to start appealing to Americans in a way that made them look more reputable. That idea of affecting American culture has gotten put on steroids in the more recent, given the more recent information environment. And so now, if you remember the self-declared alt-right, the Charlottesville rally 2017, the philosophy behind the alt-right is that we need to physically move the goalposts. We need to change American culture so that it becomes accepting of violence and intolerance. Because if we can change culture, then politics will follow. Then behaviors will follow. But it is an intentional effort to change American culture for the worse. And so, well, how do you push back on that? You grab the goalposts and you pull in the other direction, right? You make sure that our culture is intolerant to intolerance, right? And that's to me the front line, right? This is about the culture that we create. And how do you create culture? Through your behaviors. Once you engage in those behaviors, it reinforces your belief that this is the right thing to do. So under the hood of this very simple call to action, vet the vote, we've got a shortage of poll workers. That's going to create long lines and potentially increase the likelihood of voter irregularities that become an opportunity for a disinformation campaign to exploit or a violent extremist to exploit. So we're going to batten down the hatches for the poll. We're going to make sure they run really well. But in the long run, we're accomplishing something much more important, which is renorming American civic culture. And who better to lead than the veteran and military family community, which Americans look to for this kind of leadership and guidance?
Well, it does seem that it would add a layer of credibility to the issue of election integrity to have former military serving as poll watchers and working at polls and so forth, who might then be in a position to say, no, I was there and there was no problem, when we hear a lot of things put out there that are contrary to that. But with that having been said, there is also an issue with having any military, former military, as Mary McCord was talking about, police, or at a polling place. How does that factor into your assessment of the viability of this program?
It's such a good question. It's one that we think about quite a bit. Our goal is to encourage veterans and military family members to serve sort of shoulder to shoulder with their civilian counterparts. No one showing up in our program, no one showing up in camouflage, no one showing up in their kit. We have poll worker T-shirts with a purple Vet the Vote logo. It's not red, it's not blue, it's purple. We're really trying to take that potential concern away. We're not talking about securitizing the polls. And I'll give you a concrete example. We don't train our poll workers. We don't have come to our training program outside of the county level program that you're supposed to go through. Come to our training program because we're going to train you the right way to do this. No. We're reinforcing the American civic standard that you go to your county, you get training through that county process. That's the way to do this as a citizen. So we're trying to, I think, signal through our narrative campaigns the right reasons for doing this. At the same time, I've spoken with Mary, and we want to make sure that our volunteers are the most well-informed about what is the right way to do this. So we're not going to circumvent training that's provided at the county level, but we're going to make sure that our poll workers understand what is legal, what's not legal, so that if they see something, they're empowered to take the correct action. So we will try to ensure that our community is very well informed, and as per the sort of cliche with the military, that we can carry the standard. We can be the standard bearer for this civic process.
Excellent. Thank you. And now, if I may, I'd like to address what Laura and Mark like to refer to as deliverables. Each panel is responsible for leaving something that folks can take with them from the conference to think about, to work on, perhaps to pursue. And I thought in addressing that, maybe we could open it up to everyone here. The question, how do we have an honest, truly authentic discussion about all of this, about rhetoric and about election denials and about the impact of policies and so forth, without alienating one party or another, or without alienating one group of citizens or another? Because the nation is so, I mean, this is true globally, of course, but I'm focusing today in the wake of January 6th and what is unfolding in our country as we speak. You know, how do we honestly discuss this? How do we get to the truth without having one party say, well, you're portraying my whole party as being a bunch of liars and that sort of thing? This leads to the rhetoric that in turn leads to some of the violence that we're talking about. How do we do that? Does anyone care to offer a view?
If we had the answers to that one, we wouldn't be in this pickle. But I think that, you know, we have to acknowledge sometimes when you talk about it, I mean, there is a paramount threat coming from one particular ideology, but I wouldn't say it's really party ideology. It's an extremist ideology that exists outside the traditional two-party system. I mean, our work at ICAP is oftentimes bipartisan. We're able to bring conservatives and progressives together in, you know, in support of things that we all agree on. And, you know, to a person, the extremist ideology, election denial, you know, false claims of fraud, disinformation about so many things are rejected by conservatives as well as progressives. So, you know, those are the voices, I think, that have to be out there and be out there constantly bringing us back to those core things, the core civic duties that Bill was talking about that we can all agree on. I think everybody wants free and fair elections. That's one of the things that America used to be, and still is, really good at. We did have the most secure election in history in 2020. It's just no one knows that. It's true. You know, our Department of Homeland Security, even under the prior administration, agreed with that. So we just have got to get the folks. And I think part of that, and this is the last thing I'll say, is journalists need to be covering things different too.
Yeah.
I've talked to a lot of people during this conference, including journalists, about training for journalists. I think some of this is stuff that is not in their wheelhouse. It's not the traditional beat they've had. They are a little bit, you know, some people are very good, but others who just cover it sporadically really don't know how to cover it. And we need to focus on how it's portrayed in our mass communication.
And I think, I think it is really important actually to maintain a commitment to truth and to a set of norms and to democratic norms and processes, and to note that there are people that are acting and trying to pull us outside that, trying to move those goalposts. And I think we have to be willing to recognize that. And it means we need more than one strategy, right? It's not going to be one strategy or one conversation that engages everyone. We have to have that commitment to rebuilding some sort of a shared container of norms and commitment to democracy. And that means doing work that reaches different audiences, right? That means not just ignoring the extremes, but that's not about having just a conversation. That's actually about reaching people and identifying what's pulling people towards extremism and pulling people out of that and back into this space. It's not just sort of a normal conversation. I do think that we have to be asking, how can we build the broadest coalition of different and diverse voices possible that are pulling us in this direction that lets us keep democracy, that is against political violence, hate violence. And that means not just also thinking about partisan identities. I think every sector has a role to play. That means activating people based on an identity of, we're businesses, and as business leaders, we care about this. Or we're faith leaders, and as faith leaders, we care about this. So figuring out how we can activate. And then I think it is looking at what are some of those more systemic issues, like the way that platforms are engaging. They are responsive to social pressure, right? There are different pressure points that we can think about in the system and actors to influence. And the last thing I'll say is I think that we need to be looking at who are the messengers that can reach different groups and seeking to activate and engage people who can serve as messengers. I mean, the Bet the Vote, right? Part of what that does is it recruits a whole network of messengers who become messengers for democracy, who are trusted and credible to different audiences. But a lot of people that can be a hard position to be in. I talked about the attacks on people who do stand up. So we need to also be looking at where there are voices speaking out in a positive way. We can be connecting and supporting them to each other.
I was just going to very briefly say Dan Vallone works at More in Common. They have really powerful survey data that demonstrates maybe we should question the premise that we're so divided that we can't move the country forward in a positive way. Actually, Americans are wildly united around civics, if you just ask them, and don't listen to what the cable news channel says about how we feel. Yeah. So I do think that we can't give up. I'm not a Navy guy. Can't give up the ship, right? I mean, there's a lot to work with here if we just focus on it. And I really would encourage people to talk to Dan and More in Common about some of that data if this is the field that you're in.
And I would just add, one of the reasons we get into this dichotomy of left, right, one side or the other, is because of who's at the table. So everything that everyone's saying about bringing more people to the table, having a diverse coalition. I mean, what I would say is, if you're not involved in the democratic process, if you're not on the ground in some sense in a community where these issues are playing out, I don't know that you're the best person to always be the person on the stage. I don't know that you're always the person that should be, having the microphone. And if we look at who we give the microphone to, it's a lot of people who hang out with a lot of people like them. And it's a condescending environment. It's up on its high horse. It's in an ivory tower. I think that it's really important to be talking to groups that are interacting with people, that are putting those people in places and trying to make a difference, whether that is grassroots organizations whose whole focus is getting people to the polls, like your organization, or whether it's people who do other types of on-the-ground work that puts them in a position to be on the ground with community members. I want to hear more from those people, because I agree, if we were, their starting point wouldn't be, I feel so divided from my neighbor. Yep. It would be like, I feel like there's some people in my community having a hard time. I don't know how to reach them. That's a whole different conversation we're having then. So I'd encourage us bringing those people to the table.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. We started a bit late, and so we are ending a bit late, but before we call it an afternoon for this panel, I'd invite any questions from the audience. If you have any, you just raise your hand, because I don't know that this is working, the tablet next to me. Oh, okay. Well,
I'm moderating
we're
the
actually,
next panel,
we're
so I
actually
can-
going to have to end this right now. Anyway, how about a round of applause for the panel? Thank you.